honored to be here this afternoon, and I want to thank the Guibord Center for this opportunity. I want to thank all of you for coming out on a Saturday afternoon from 1 to 3, no less, to hear about someone who I think is not only one of the most profound figures to have lived in the last century, but who I also think is increasingly relevant for our times. Someone who was a prophetic voice during his own lifetime and whose words I think are even more timely today. Kahlil Gibran, the early 20th century, Lebanese-born, Arab-American, poet-artist, and mystic, most known, of course, in the West as the author of the best-selling book, The Prophet. I'm just curious, in an audience like this, how many of you, at one time in your life or another, came in contact with the Prophet or Gibran in some of his other writings? Just raise your hand. It's very interesting. You know, and I go around and speak. Sometimes you have quite large audiences. Sometimes 95% of those there have been influenced by, especially the Prophet. But so few know much about him. I grew up in Senegal, West Africa, as was mentioned a minute ago, a Muslim majority context. I spent the first 18 years of my life there. And when you need wisdom or counsel in a context like that, you go to an elder, someone with life experience, someone who has gray hair. Some of you qualify in here in that category. And they always respond with proverbs or parables, usually in the local language, which is Wolof. And when I think about this long journey that I've been on of looking deeply into the life and the spirituality of Kahlil Gibran, which actually resulted in writing this book, there's a Wolof proverb that comes to mind. And it goes like this, first in the language of Wolof. Soame hade tugolo sa ngemba dutakmuk. And it means this: if you have a monkey for your friend, you'll never get your loincloth stuck in a tree. Meaning, it's who you know at challenging moments in time that makes all the difference. And there's no question that that was very much what was behind me going on this profound exploration, if you will, into the life of Kahlil Gibran. Sometimes something written long ago becomes seemingly even more relevant than during its own day, as happened here about a year ago with George Orwell's 1984, which shot to the best-selling list, of course. And more than ever, I think there's a need to hear voices that call us to unity and to respect. That's what the march is all about out there. To be inspired to live deeply and generously in our thinking and our actions toward the other, whomever the other is. And I believe Kahlil Gibran is just that voice, and he offers us profound insights for our day, much needed wisdom and guidance. It's all started for me when I was living in the Middle East. I'm 53 years of age, and I spent most of my life in North Africa or the Middle East. And I was struck by how enthusiastically Kahlil Gibran is loved, both throughout the Middle East and certainly in much of the West. The East was proud of him, and the West admired him. He was very much this uniting figure. And it intrigued me to look more deeply, not just into his life and his work, but into his inner journey of spiritual development, his kind of spiritual formation, if you will. And in so doing, I came to discover that Kahlil Gibran is really the supreme East-West figure. And as a result, can be very much for us what I would consider an unparalleled spiritual guide for our times, related to peace, related to harmony, certainly related to the building of bridges between the creeds and cultures of the Middle East and West. And his life and approach and work, they touch on so many of the critical issues of today. A bridge, yes, for us between creeds and cultures. Care for the environment, equality for women, interest in spirituality as opposed to institutional religion, immigration, the status of refugees, Syria and the conflict in the Middle East, the inclusive embrace of those of different faiths and looking for the best in each tradition, and the list goes on. And of course, he also touches on that spiritual depth that so many people crave. On the crisis in Syria during his time, he wrote, "My heart burns for Syria. Fate has been most cruel to her. Her gods are dead, her children left her to seek bread in faraway lands, and yet she's still alive. And that's the most painful thing." It could have been written yesterday. As it was said about Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Arab Sufi mystic, poet, and scholar, he is a man for this time because he has his foot in every camp. And I wanted to delve more deeply into his inner spiritual journey and immerse myself in his writings and the environments that shaped him. And more specifically, I sought to understand what led him from being someone that was born into, at that time, a exclusive, historic, and intolerant, sectarian Christian community, to becoming someone who actually ended up embracing all in our world, and as a result, very often is embraced by all. And it took me all over the world, to museums, to art galleries, to churches, to mosques, through revolutions, through counter-revolutions. It first involved, over the course of several years, visiting all the places that he lived and taking Kahlil with me, so to speak. In other words, taking his writings and reading everything he wrote in the order that he wrote them, in the places that he wrote them, during each respective phase of his life. It also led me to the far-reaching places of influence that his writings and his art have traveled. I began in his birthplace village of Bishari, where I actually was about 12 days ago, high up in the snowy mountains of Lebanon. And then on to Boston, where he and his family emigrated. To Paris, where he did his art training. To New York, where he spent most of his career. Ending up in Mexico City, of all places, at the spectacular Museo Sumaya, where the largest collection of Kahlil's art and writings is held in the Western Hemisphere. And so many places in between, such as Cairo, Egypt, where almost all of his works written in Arabic were first published, to Savannah, Georgia, and the Telfair Museums, which have the largest collection of his art here in the United States, to the Detroit area and the Arab American National Museum that are focused very much on preserving his legacy, and so many places in between where monuments and streets and schools and parks are named after him. And it didn't take me long to realize that I knew a lot less about Kahlil than I had imagined. I knew he was Lebanese. I knew he was of Christian background, though I admit as a young man I actually assumed he was Muslim, as a lot of people do because of the title The Prophet, his best-selling book. I knew that he lived in the early 1990s, and I knew that he had written a spiritual best-selling book of poetry titled The Prophet. However, what I didn't know was far greater. I didn't know that Kahlil is one of the most widely read poets in history, behind only Shakespeare and Lao Tzu. I didn't know that Elvis Presley was one of his greatest fans and gave away thousands of copies of The Prophet, had completely memorized it, was able to open it up, and you could just pinpoint an area and he could finish the entire book by heart. One of his last great projects was working on a feature film of The Prophet. I didn't know that the singer Johnny Cash was equally captivated by Kahlil's writings and message. I didn't know that he was a friend of the Teddy Roosevelt family. I didn't know that he was sought out after by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats to have his portrait drawn by him, and that Yeats's wife loved it so much that she begged Kahlil to do one of her as well. I didn't know that he knew and drew the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung and the Indian Nobel Prize laureate Rabindranath Tagore. I didn't know that he met Auguste Rodin, the great French sculptor, when he was studying art in Paris, and that while he was in Paris, some of the great Impressionist artists were still around: Monet, Renoir, Degas, Marie Cassatt, even Picasso, in his early days, was around at that time. And while Gibran was in Paris, Marc Chagall moved to Paris. I didn't know that the morning after the Titanic sank, when he was obviously very troubled and had been unable to sleep, he struggled to know if he should actually cancel his appointment to draw the portrait of the leader of the Baha'i faith, Abdul Baha. He decided to go ahead with the sitting, and he was profoundly moved by Abdu'l-Baha's calming presence. I didn't know, more humorously, that during the height of the American prohibition on alcohol, Kahlil, with his proclivity toward Arak, that strong Levantine, anise-flavored alcoholic drink, was able to secure, almost miraculously, this continuing flowing stash of the contraband. I didn't know that Queen Noor was influenced by Kahlil's work at a young age and is an avid promoter of his writings, as are the actors Salma Hayek and Liam Neeson. I didn't know that Kahlil was almost excommunicated by his own Maronite Catholic Church as a heretic for its early attacks on the religious hypocrisy that he saw in it, and yet paradoxically at the very end, at his funeral at the Cathedral in Beirut, he was honored by the Maronite Patriarch and all other church authorities in Lebanon, as well as from leaders of other faiths from all around the world. I didn't know that Kahlil's writings were instrumental actually in sparking a reformation, even a renaissance in Arabic literature, as he broke with the rigid Arabic literary canons of his day and very much through his prose poetry developed a new genre of Arabic literature. I didn't realize that he was seen as a political revolutionary early on in his career, speaking out through his writings against the injustices of the Ottoman occupation in Lebanon, which was called Syria then, Greater Syria, and calling on his fellow countrymen to rise up to free themselves from that oppressive yoke. I didn't know that one of the wealthiest men in the world, Carlos Slim, a Mexican of Lebanese heritage, has one of the largest collections of Kahlil's art and writings down in Mexico City. I didn't know that one of President John F. Kennedy's most famous quotes was taken from an article that Kahlil wrote in Arabic to his countrymen: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." I had no idea of the scope of his influence worldwide, both in terms of his reach geographically and as to the diversity and the breadth of the groups that identify with him. I remember being in Timbuktu, Mali, in the Sahara Desert, and in this little mud brick home of a Tuareg friend. The men in blue is what they're called there in the desert. And there's hardly any furniture in this home, and there's a little rickety bookshelf there, and on it is a French copy of the Prophet. And he seems to be claimed by every group and circle imaginable. Kahlil the poet, Kahlil the novelist, Kahlil the essayist, Kahlil the activist, the revolutionary, the counterculturalist, Kahlil the philosopher, Kahlil the artist, Kahlil the painter, Kahlil the modernizer of Arab literature, Kahlil the prophet, Kahlil the New Age guru, Kahlil the visionary, Kahlil the humanitarian, Kahlil the Sufi, Kahlil the Christian, Kahlil the universalist, Kahlil the interfaith mentor. He's an enigma, begging the question, will the real Kahlil Gibran please stand up? The renowned contemporary Syrian poet Adonis summed it up perfectly when speaking of Kahlil. He's a star spinning outside the orbit of that other sun in his universal acceptance. Kahlil's older friend and fellow writer Amin Rahani, whose portrait, incidentally, is on the cover of my book — this is not Gibran, this is actually a portrait of his best friend — said of him, through Arabic, he conquered our minds, and through English, he conquered our hearts. Kahlil Gibran was born in 1883 into a Maronite Christian family high up in the mountains in Lebanon, a region known as the Kadisha Valley, which means the Sacred Valley. It was a place that had sheltered its people over the centuries through many invasions, and it resounds with majestic natural beauty, which had an important and a lasting influence on him. In contrast, though, to those gorgeous, peaceful surroundings, he was born into a period of political and interreligious strife, as well as one full of religious corruption by the authorities, the religious authorities, during that latter part of a 400-year-long Ottoman occupation. All circumstances that would influence his life and work for years to come. Kahlil was a quiet, creative child, and his mother stood out as a caring and empowering presence in his life. And sensing his unique creative talents and what you might even say his spiritual sensitivity very early on as a child, She sought to encourage him, and at one point she secured a copy of Leonardo da Vinci's artwork to give him as a gift, which Kahlil remembered as a pivotal moment in his early life. He was only 6 years old, and he wrote of the experience. "I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. It was as if a ship lost in the fog had suddenly found a compass." His grandfather had been a Maronite priest, and thanks to his mother, he was taught the great biblical epic stories which captured his imagination at a young age, which are often known by Christian, Muslims, and Jews. And of course, it showed up again, if you know his writing, his imagery, as he continued on his career. Kahlil's family was not very reliable, prone to drink, with gambling debts, and his father was accused of embezzlement while working for the local Ottoman administrator, and he was sent to prison, and all the family's property was lost. And his mother eventually decided to follow her relatives to America here and emigrated with Kahlil's half-brother and his 2 young sisters just before he entered his teenage years. And although Kahlil spent only 12 short years in that magical mountainous setting, it was to serve as the foundation for his spirituality for the rest of his life. Once in America, they settled into Boston's South End, and Kahlil began to learn English, and a whole new world of artistic influences began to open up to him. As a young teenager, he met the avant-garde Bostonian photographer and publisher, Fred Holland Day, who was equally intrigued with this young Kahlil from the Middle East, and Day introduced him to the whole new world, a vast world of literature and of art, and very much encouraged his artistic ability. Concerned, though, that Kahlil, as often happens, by the way, with Middle Easterners when they move to the West, concerned that he was losing his Arabic culture and his values, his mother decides to send him back to Lebanon to complete his high school education under the watchful care of the Maronite Catholic Church in East Beirut. And his story unfolds from there. Upon his return to Boston, after lycée, after high school, and within an 18-month period, he lost one of his sisters and his half-brother to tuberculosis, and then his mother quickly to cancer. After a devastating fire that pretty much destroyed everything that he had painted to date, he begins to write, and he writes more intensely, and he becomes involved with the world of Arab immigrant writers in Boston. And he began to express his feelings through outspoken, some might even say scorching, articles in Arabic newspapers here in the U.S. and books and magazines. And as an immigrant, he discovered he actually had the liberty to write in a way that he never would have been able to write had he lived in the Arab world at that time. And with boldness and without repercussions, he crafts stories and articles addressing highly sensitive issues. He began to call on his Lebanese people to question ideologies, and as he himself began to grapple with religion and spirituality. He spoke out in his articles against the oppression by the Ottomans, and he was concerned by sectarian strife that was more often than not then fueled by the religious authorities. And of course, he was very, very disgusted with their hypocrisy. And during this time, he also became very passionate about women's rights. And for the next 10 years, 1903 to 1913, from the age of 20 to 30, Kahlil would seek to balance the push and pull of these two linguistic and artistic worlds as he found himself poised at a confluence of cross-currents between the East and West. And determined to tear down walls of injustice, he eventually found himself threatened with excommunication from authorities in the Maronite Catholic Church of his upbringing. He had just completed a brilliant work titled Spirits Rebellious, in which, interestingly, one of the stories he titled Kahlil the Heretic. And he blasts the hypocrisy of religious corruption, oppression of the weak and the vulnerable. And not surprisingly, not too long after this, while he's in Paris, representatives of the Patriarch in Lebanon who were visiting France asked to see him in order to put him in line. And he related the encounter quite lightheartedly to a friend who recorded it in her journal. She wrote of the experience. One bishop had a sense of humor, the other none. Not much has changed, by the way, in that regard. Non-humorists took him aside, You've made a grave mistake and are making a grave mistake. Your gifts you are using against your people, against your country, against your church, and the Holy Patriarch realizes this. And now seek out every copy of the book, destroy them all, and let me take word from you back to Syria and the church and the Holy Patriarch. Well, as you can imagine, that exchange only spurred Kahlil on further, and he actually early on saw himself somewhat as a revolutionary and a rebel, writing that life without rebellion is like the seasons without spring. He was an advocate for freedom within and without. He wrote to a cousin around that time who was living in Brazil, "The people in Syria are calling me a heretic. And the intelligentsia in Egypt vilifies me, saying he's an enemy of just laws, of family ties, and of old traditions." Those writers are telling the truth. Because I do not love man-made laws, and I abhor the traditions that our ancestors left us. This hatred is the fruit, though, of my love for the sacred and spiritual kindness, which should be the source of every law upon the earth. For kindness is the shadow of God in man. Through his Arabic novella titled Broken Wings, he became an advocate for women, well ahead of his time, very apropos to think about today because of this march. He had an incredibly high view of women, whether friend or stranger or lover or sister or mother, and he consistently fused his admiration for them into the essence of his painting and his writing. It's especially noteworthy considering the patriarchal society of his childhood, and also the time period here in America in which he was immersed as women were in the thick of the fight for the right to vote. Even his view of God echoed these convictions of gender equality and pushed the boundaries very much at that time of the accepted norm. He wrote, "Most religions speak of God in the masculine gender. God is to me as much a mother as God is a father. God is both father and mother in one." However, albeit an activist early on in his life, as he often wrote of growing into our greater selves, you see him mature into this individual with a graciousness towards all and an all-embracing spirituality that reaches across the divides of humanity, building bridges of peace. And he moves from being an activist to very much more so an artistic contemplative, using his many creative gifts to communicate his insights. And regarding his art and writing, one supported the other. When asked which he preferred, he refused to separate them, responding with the impossibility of choosing a favorite child. At a very crucial time in his life, he was introduced to what became his lifelong friend and patron, Mary Haskell, who appeared in a very supportive role to him, setting him on a course that would allow him to pursue and cultivate his many gifts. She eventually funded 2 years of art education in Paris so he could master the fundamentals, and from that experience he was allowed to discover and cultivate his own unique style that the world now knows him for. After his time in Paris, he moved to New York City, and he continued to publish works in Arabic and exhibited his artwork at a few very significant galleries. And then in 1918, his first book in English was published, titled The Madman, and it was quickly followed by a second book. These are written in English, not translated. A second book titled The Forerunner, and by 1923, his third book in English, The Prophet, quickly gained worldwide acclaim, as his message of universality and respect was reaching far wider audiences. He also worked on his longest English book, Jesus the Son of Man, for much of his adult life, seeking to return the Jesus that he very much felt had been disfigured here in the West back to his Middle Eastern origins, publishing this creative masterwork just 3 years before he died at the age of 48. The more I studied of Kahlil's fascinating life, the more intrigued I became with his inward journey. More than anything else, it was evident that his life was lived toward what you might say a deeper dimension, and he wove this passionate intent into the core of his writings in art. He was a natural mystic who quite simply sought to build bridges and tear down walls. And his voice is timeless, appealing to heart and mind, faith and reason, a guiding spirit very much now at a time when stereotypes and misunderstandings are increasing ever-widening divides. As he so powerfully wrote, I believe in the book, capital B, that makes us all brothers and sisters equal before the sun. I believe in the teachings that set you and me free from any kind of bondage and place us unfettered here upon the earth, the stepping place of the feet of God. Certainly, heeding his wisdom would go a long way to healing our world. And in this regard, I think it seems to me that there are two overarching themes to Kahlil's life and work. And the best analogy I can think of is one that he used a lot, that of a river. But as I think of his life, I think of it as a river flowing deep and wide. As he plumbed the depths of his inner life, he went to the core of human existence. He was forever exploring the deepest of life's questions on the purpose of being, he writes. Spiritual awakening is the most essential thing in life, and it's the sole purpose of being. He who does not befriend his soul is an enemy of humanity, for life emerges from within. He described himself as literally going into the silence, intentionally so. He wrote, only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. He even named his New York studio the Hermitage, and he decorated it sparsely in a manner that created a contemplative atmosphere for him. A simple wooden bed, several crucifixes made of wood and metal, a small brass chalice, an easel, a tapestry, a large tapestry of a Middle Eastern Christ that hung on the wall above an altar-like table with two big brass candlesticks. I love Kahlil's short story titled The Tempest. That's very well known in the Arab world. It's infused with the imagery of a hermitage in his childhood village in Lebanon. It's actually now the place that he's buried. The story tells of a young man who's roaming the cedar forest there in the mountains one autumn afternoon, and he gets caught in a terrible rainstorm. And he seeks cover in an isolated shelter that's actually inhabited by a hermit named Yusuf. And he's heard of Yusuf from the local villagers and had longed to meet him one day to learn his spiritual secrets. And this storm, of course, provides him the perfect excuse. And when the young man is welcomed into Yusuf's shelter, he notices that the old man is tending to a bird with broken wings, so symbolism abounds here. And the old hermit engages in conversation and slowly imparts his wisdom through all this beautiful imagery. And he shares that he left the world to live in the awakeness of life and to think upon the compelling and beautiful mystery of existence. He says, I came to this far corner of God's domain, for I hungered to learn the secrets of the universe and approach close to the throne of God. And as the story climaxes, the hermit leaves the young man sheltered there in the hermitage, and he walks out into the storm at the height when it's its fiercest. And he says to the young man, I'm now going to walk through the night with the tempest. It's a practice that I enjoy greatly. I hope you will teach yourself to love the tempest. Kahlil consistently succeeded at crafting these poetic invitations to journey toward the depths of oneself, exploring that rich reservoir within. In another reflection, he notes, God has placed in each soul an apostle to lead us on an illumined path. And yet many seek life from without, unaware that it is actually within them. When someone asked him once, what's a mystic? Kahlil is said to have smiled and replied, nothing very secret nor formidable, just someone who has drawn aside one more veil. He was constantly listening, paying attention to life, ever in search of greater interior depth. The soul is mightier than space, he said, stronger than time, deeper than the sea, and higher than the stars. And he was preoccupied during his entire life with the depths that he knew the spirit of humanity was able to plumb and the heights that he was convinced humanity was destined to scale, always striving toward that deeper dimension. He spoke of his painting process in similar terms to his friend and patron Mary Haskell. When I paint a picture, I try to give the picture a presence. It's the coming together of certain elements in a certain way, as if they made a sort of path along which God can come through to our consciousness. Another time he wrote to her, "I've obtained a first-rate telescope, and I spend an hour or two every evening staring into infinity, close to that which is distant and remote, and in awe of the greater whole." Kahlil saw depth everywhere. The collection of imagery and created synonyms that Kahlil used for God are many: the infinite, the almighty, God creator, nature, love, eternal wisdom, unseen, eternal altar, all-powerful, supreme infinite, Lord of life and of love and of death, great spirit, great intelligent being, great power, the unknown, the great sea, the great river, the absolute. Of Kahlil's belief in God, his contemporary Lebanese biographer Alexander Najjar writes, "What kind of God did Gibran believe in? His view of God was not mainstream. Gibran's mysticism is a convergence of several different influences: Christianity, Islam, Sufism, Theosophy, and Jungian psychology. It was a message of coexistence. He rejected fanaticism and religious segregation of any kind and called his convictions from a synthesis of different religious messages without their dogmatism. He could not reasonably confine himself to any one of the three great monotheistic religions." And over again, Kahlil focused in his work on love for the divine or the transcendent rather than religion. During a time of deep despair and discouragement, and by the way, you cannot understand Kahlil unless you understand that he suffered. During a time of difficulty, he said, "But somehow, when I feel like a little helpless fish in a muddy lake, I cannot help but say to myself, the air which is above the water is not muddy. I cannot lose my faith in the God element." And in a time when I think it becomes harder and harder, actually, to listen to our inner selves, our souls, or however you want to term that, to listen to what we may need spiritually, I think he exemplifies someone who journeyed intentionally inward, creating room for silence and to listen to the quiet nudgings of his soul, and intent on allowing both the high and low moments of life to weave together into one voice. And it's that voice within a voice that Kahlil wanted his readers to hear when reading his writings. As his good friend, the eminent American architect and writer Claude Bragdon said of him, his power came from a great reservoir of spiritual life, else it could not have been so universal or so potent. But the majesty and the beauty of the language with which he clothed it were all his own. I think this depth is what led the actor Salma Hayek to produce a film on Kahlil's book, The Prophet. Perhaps some of you have seen it. One of my most enjoyable kind of research trips on working on this book was to go to the premiere of The Prophet at the Toronto International Film Festival. And it's an animated adaptation of The Prophet, and it's directed by Roger Ayers, who's most known for The Lion King. And the film, actually, I found, was a visual extravaganza with animated chapters from award-winning animation directors from all over the world, and beautiful music featuring world-class musicians, singers, and composers such as Yo-Yo Ma and Gabriel Yared. It was a deeply moving experience for me. In fact, it was the only time, with the exception of the film Gandhi, that I've observed such reverent silence in a cinema when the film ended. No one in this diverse audience from all over the world, and most were young people, moved or said a thing. The after party, I had the opportunity of speaking with Salma about her inspiration in producing the film, and with her contagious exuberance, she shared her own connection to the Prophet, which was through her Lebanese grandfather, who she remembers always had kept a copy of the Prophet there on his bedside table or stand. Later, as a young adult, she read the Prophet herself and was profoundly moved. She told us, "I found out that there are millions of people around the world who have shared the same kind of connection to this book, in which the words of Kahlil have so strongly impacted them positively and spiritually. And when you read this book, something really strange happens inside of you. Your soul recognizes it as truth." She went on to say to me that that's why she made the film. She said, "I thought it was crucial that we pay further tribute to this man who was an Arab, who wrote a book of spiritual philosophy that unites all religions and all countries and all creeds from many different generations." And in those comments, I think Salma really captured the essence of Kahlil's inner journey, because the deeper he went, the wider actually his embrace became. The depth of Kahlil's spiritual journey led to this extraordinary breadth of spirit in which he experienced the oneness of humanity. The reservoirs that he cultivated in the deep actually gave him the capacity to go wide. And arising from his internalized bridging of Eastern and Eastern and Western influences in his life, a faith emerged over time that actually transcended all cultures and all religions. Addressing his fellow Arabs in the Middle East, Kahlil wrote, "Humans are divided into different clans and tribes and belong to countries and towns. But I find myself a stranger to all communities and belong to no settlement. The universe is my country, and the human family is my tribe. Thou art my brother and my sister because you are human, and we are both children of one Holy Spirit. We are equal and made of the same earth." Kahlil went beyond religion to the core of a universal spirituality. And at that time, this is after World War I, when the Middle East was being divided up, of course, by the West, somewhat artificially, the West tended to think of it in terms of Muslim civilization and Christian civilization. Kahlil only thought of it as one civilization. And his beliefs cut through such divides, reaching across to the other. And as he so powerfully said, "Your neighbor is your other self, dwelling behind a wall, and understanding all walls fall down." Obviously, he recognized the necessity of boundaries and nations, and yet he very much strove toward a borderless citizenship that transcended geography. I love the way he addressed his collective embrace for humanity with the beautiful poetic visual imagery of a cloud. He wrote, "Should you sit upon a cloud, you would not see the boundary line between one farm and another, or between one country and another. It's a pity you cannot sit upon a cloud." Just before the onset of the First World War, Kahlil wrote an essay titled "An Open Letter from a Christian Poet to Muslims," and in it he refers to himself as a Christian who placed Jesus in one half of his heart and Muhammad in the other. Kahlil's ever-embracing spirituality continued to mature and was thoughtfully expressed in his collection of aphorisms in English titled "Sand and Foam," and in that he wrote, "Should you really open your eyes and see, you would behold your image in all images. And should you open your ears and listen, you would hear your own voice in all voices." Obviously, words that continue to echo and inspire. In touching on the most sensitive topic of all in the Middle East, religion, he does so by looking to the nature of God. "You are my brother and sister, and I love you. I love you worshiping in your church, kneeling in your temple, and praying in your mosque. You and I are all children of one religion, and the varied paths of religion are but the fingers of the loving hand of the Supreme Being, extended to all, offering completeness of spirit to all, and anxious to receive all. And finding a way to powerfully communicate a non-sectarian version of spirituality was something that weighed very heavily on Kahlil. And consequently, he felt all the events of his life seemed to lead him toward the creation of his most well-known book, The Prophet. Of the Prophet, and this is what it looked like when it first came out, it was called The Little Black Book. Of the Prophet, he wrote, "It's the biggest challenge of my life. My entire being is in the Prophet. Everything I've ever done before was only a prelude to this." And he felt almost a sense of sacred responsibility while he was writing it, as if it was to be a holy book. Even the process of writing it was a type of spiritual rebirth for him. And embodying East and West, it speaks to people from all religions, and it prompted his friend and patron and sometimes editor, Mary Haskell, to remark upon first receiving a copy of it when it was released, "Oh, Kahlil, it's the most loving book ever written." The Prophet actually made his literary debut in a public reading in Manhattan's East Village at St. Mark's in the Bowery, an Episcopal church. It's the oldest continuous place of practice, of religious practice in New York. And the then rector at that time was a very progressive person, and he was a close friend of Frank Lloyd Wright. He knew Kahlil, and Kahlil exhibited some of his art there for a while. And then when the Prophet came out, he invited him to have a public reading of the Prophet. Kahlil didn't do the reading. They invited a well-known actor, Butler Davenport, to do it. And Kahlil was there. I gave a talk there not too long ago, and they showed me where Kahlil was sitting during that first public reading. And there, after the reading, Kahlil said, he said two things. The first thing he said, "I sure wish he hadn't read the whole thing." And then the second thing is, I had first wanted it read in a church. Interestingly, as Kahlil continued to journey spiritually, he sought to sift through his own religious upbringing, through all the baggage and trappings and tradition that had accumulated around it over the millennia. And just as the Dalai Lama is said to have encouraged the Trappist monk and writer Thomas Merton to not convert to Buddhism, because he was very much taken with Buddhism, but instead to go deeply into his own tradition and find its core essence, Kahlil finds himself actually doing the same thing and discovering the figure of Jesus actually in a new way. And he came to see the person of Jesus as far beyond Christianity and instead as almost a universal sage for all humanity. In Jesus, he saw this all-embracing figure, and he was enraptured by his character. He said his life is the symbol of humanity. He shall always be to me the supreme figure of all ages. And one of my little favorite vignettes of Kahlil's is about separating the Jesus of history from the Jesus of a religion, Christianity, that grew up around him. Kahlil writes, "Once every 100 years, Jesus of Nazareth meets Jesus of the Christian in a garden among the hills of Lebanon. And they talk long. And each time, Jesus of Nazareth goes away saying to Jesus of the Christian, 'My friend, I fear we shall never, never agree.'" Observing the corruption and inequalities and even sectarian power plays of the church in Lebanon at that time as a young man, he was obviously naturally drawn to this radical aspect of Jesus' all-embracive, all-inclusive love, and also the strength of his humility. It was the antithesis of everything he saw in institutional Christianity at that time. And he considered Jesus to be the greatest of all artists and poets. He is the master poet who makes poets of us all. He also pictured Jesus as a fellow Middle Easterner, and he felt this deep personal cultural connection to Jesus, and hence the opportunity to write about Jesus' life became this ever-increasing aspiration. Jesus, the Son of Man, was the longest and the last book that Kahlil wrote before his death. Some actually see it almost like a fifth gospel, and in it he delivers a mesmerizing picture of the essence of Jesus. Although Kahlil often spoke directly of God, his writings and his art were infused with a far greater concern, that of living in harmony with one another and with all creation. He wrote, "I bid you to speak not so freely of God, yes, who is your all, but rather speak to and understand one another, neighbor unto neighbor." Ideals, of course, so important and so necessary in our contemporary context. Also to Kahlil, while spirituality served as an attempt to connect with the divine, he realized that it could not be found in creeds or dogma, and that to search for God solely in a mosque or a church or a temple was very much to limit one's search for wholeness. And so his quest became this opportunity to unearth that which was woven into the very fabric of creation, in other words, the environment. And in an age when issues in our environment are at the forefront, with deep respect for the earth, Kahlil's holistic worldview very much rings forth. And he didn't separate the spiritual dimension of life from the natural world, but he saw them very much in harmony. Just after Easter in 1931, after a battle with ill health, Kahlil lay dying. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, the same hospital that actually received survivors from the Titanic disaster for treatment, and was then again used to treat victims of the September 11 attack. At age 48, with cirrhosis of the liver and tuberculosis in one lung, Kahlil slipped from this world into the realm he believed would be an endless dawn, forever the first day. And the breadth of diversity and the outpouring of appreciation for his life, I think, says it all, reaching across all religious and cultural divides. In New York City, it was a rabbi who had known Kahlil since his early days in the U.S. that undertook the task of arranging the tribute. It was titled "A Tribute to the Spirit of Kahlil Gibran." And it was a mosaic of diversity, with leaders from numerous faith traditions praising his life: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, Theosophist. As requested in his will, Kahlil's body then made the pilgrimage back to Lebanon, accompanied by his sister, Mariana. Upon arriving by ship in Beirut, the coffin was opened and he was posthumously awarded the Decoration of Fine Arts Medallion from the Ministry of Education for his life's work. And then, led by governmental dignitaries, French military officers, diplomats from all over the world, and leaders from Christian, Muslim, Druze, and Jewish communities, along with crowds of school children, the entourage processed past thousands of admirers who lined the streets until they reached the Maronite Catholic Cathedral, where his body was blessed by the Archbishop. Once thought of as a rebel by the church, in the end, he's welcomed home as a celebrated native son. In the tribute to Kahlil that was held the next day in Beirut's Grand Theater, the president of Lebanon, renowned writers and poets, representatives from the Islamic, Christian, and Druze communities, they all reflected on Kahlil's spirituality and his universal appeal. There's a Christian speaker there that day who said he was a Sufi sage for all humanity. And then the procession on foot made the 50-mile journey from Beirut all the way up to his home village up in the mountains of Bishari, and all the way without any break, lined with townspeople. They stopped 20 times for local ceremonies. Then he was eventually laid to rest, as he had requested, in the hermitage grotto of his childhood, high up in the mountains of his beloved cedar trees, which is actually now the Gibran Museum. More than ever, Kahlil's own words rang true. For in one soul are contained the hopes and feelings of all mankind. One of my favorite allegories by Kahlil is titled "The River." It's frequently read at funerals and memorial services, and is reminiscent of Longfellow's Hiawatha. It's set in his beloved Kadisha Valley, the sacred valley, and it visually highlights, I think, Kahlil's life journey, one mixed with both joy and suffering, but which always led to that deeper realm, the river. In the valley where the mighty river flows, two little streams met and spoke to one another. One stream said, "How came you, my friend, and how was your path?" And the other answered, "My path was most encumbered. The wheel of the mill was broken, and the master farmer who used to conduct me from my channel to the plants is dead. And I struggled down, oozing with the waste of those who do not but sit and bake their laziness in the sun. But how is your path, my brother?" And the other stream answered and said, "Mine was a different path. I came down the hills among fragrant flowers and shy willows. Men and women drank of me with silvery cups, and little children paddled their rosy feet at my edges, and there was laughter all about me, and there were sweet songs. What a pity that your path was not so happy." At that moment the river spoke with a loud voice and said, come in, we are going to the sea. Come in, speak no more. We are going to the sea. Be with me now. Come in, for in me you shall forget your wanderings, sad or joyful. Come in, and you and I will forget all our ways when we reach the heart of our mother, the sea. Kahlil's life journey of depth and breadth, I think, can't help but challenge all of us. His words continue to reverberate in hearts and souls, stirring the reader or hearer, whoever he or she may be, to journey toward that deeper dimension. He reminds us that it's actually time to reach across the divides that surround us and break down every wall of inequality and injustice that we can. It's time to build bridges in whatever ways we can conceive and seek peaceful resolutions. It's time to defend the vulnerable and the oppressed. It's time to unite and see our own reflections in the faces of others. It's time to find a way to carve out room for quiet and respect for creation, the environment. And it's time to even delve deeper into our own spiritual traditions and cast out all the outward imperfections and trappings and to the core of life. In one final vignette from Kahlil, his words inspire and challenge us towards, as he often said, our greater selves. It's titled, "Set a Sheet of Snow White Paper." Set a sheet of snow white paper, pure was I created, and pure will I remain forever. I would rather be burnt and turn to white ashes than suffer darkness to touch me or the unclean to come near me. And the ink bottle heard the white paper saying that, and it laughed in its dark heart, but it never dared to approach her. And the multicolored pencils heard her also, and they too, though, never came near her. And the snow white sheet of paper did remain pure and chaste forever. Pure and chaste and empty. I close with the moving words of Kahlil's good friend, Mikhail Naimi, who wrote the first biography of Kahlil just 3 years after he died. For some purpose unknown to you and to me, Gibran was born in Lebanon at the time he was born. And for a reason hidden from you and me, Arabic was his mother tongue. It would seem that the all-seeing eye perceived our spiritual drought and sent us this rain-bearing cloud to drizzle some relief to our parching souls.